Mr. President.
Senator from Missouri.
Mr. President, I had a few minutes yesterday before the vote, the Congressional Review Act vote on this truly terrible EPA rule on water to talk about the reasons that EPA shouldn't do this, the long-term understanding of what navigable waters meant, the ability for EPA, if they wanted to change the law, to come and ask the Congress to change the law. But of course, they don't want to do any of that. In fact, I had a small version of this map yesterday, which shows the Farm Bureau projection that I believe other projections agree with of how much of our state would be covered by this new jurisdiction of the federal government over essentially all the waters in the country. If you'll notice, the only part of Missouri that would be covered under the under the waters of the United States rule is just the part that's in red. Only 99.7% of the state would be under this new jurisdiction that the EPA would ask for, that nobody surely believes the EPA could ever exercise this jurisdiction. And uniquely, as it relates to this rule, I think uniquely is the right word to say here, federal agency after federal agency oppose the EPA going forward with this rule. This is basically not just the EPA versus against a few people that are concerned about it. It's the EPA versus anybody that's looked at it. According to the Small Business Administration, by the way, Mr. President, another agency of the federal government headed by someone else who's appointed by the president, they have a number of concerns. One is that utility companies would have a hard time complying with the law in a way that allowed the power grid to continue to be utilized. And of course, anything that raises utility company power cost raises the cost to the consumer. There's no mythical way that anybody else pays for that except the people that get utility bills, which is almost every person in America, or at least the family of almost every person in America. The Home Builders Association of St. Louis believes that if this rule goes into effect, on average, the increased cost for permitting to build a home would go from a little under $30,000. Right now, the average cost, at least for St. Louis home builders, to get all the permitting necessary is $28,915. They believe that would increase by 10 times. So to build the average permit to build a home, if this silly waters of the U.S. thing is allowed to happen, would go from a little under $30,000 to $271,596, and the wait time would go from a little less than a year to more than 2 years just to get the permitting you need, Mr. President, to build a home. Now, the SBA also says that the rule will increase permitting costs generally by $52 million in the country, just for permitting costs generally, and environmental mitigation cost by $113 million every year. With the addition of the power rule that the EPA also has out, I think you'd be hard to come up with a third rule that would do anywhere as much damage as the two rules that they already have out there to the American economy. In April of 2015, a memo from Major General John Peabody to the Assistant Secretary of the Corps of Engineers, Secretary Darcy, states that in the Corps' judgment, the documents contain numerous inappropriate assumptions with no connections to the data provided and logical inconsistencies. So this is the Corps of Engineers, not necessarily my favorite federal agency. This is their view of the EPA rule. And this rule would also mean that the federal bureaucrats, assuming you could ever assemble enough of them to do the job that the EPA says they'd like here, can decide what falls under the jurisdiction, and they'd be deciding from a long way away. You know, this kind of authority is barely able to be exercised by the local city or county. Becomes even more complicated when the State Department of Natural Resources gets involved. It would be impossible to do and will slow down both the economy and add cost to families. 31 states including mine, including this state here, where, again, I'll point out only the red part is covered by waters of the U.S. 31 states have sued the EPA to overturn the rule. The courts appear to be listening. The district court that covers our district in North Dakota issued an injunction for 13 states. Then in early October, the Sixth Circuit issued a nationwide stay on the rule. So not only is the Congress concerned, a majority of the Congress, unfortunately only 59 senators were concerned with something that 60 senators could have solved. But not only the Congress is involved, but federal agency after federal agency, the courts themselves, this should not be allowed to happen. I hope we see the Congressional Review Act put this issue exactly where it deserves to be, on the president's desk. He appointed the head of the EPA. Senate confirmed the head of the EPA. I didn't vote to confirm the head of the EPA. In fact, I held that nomination back as long as I could possibly hold the nomination back, hoping that the new nominee would suggest they were going to be better than the person who'd been holding the job before. This rule indicates that the EPA doesn't really have the best interest of the country at heart. They don't have a reasonable way to enforce the authority they say they'd like to have. I look forward to the president having to deal directly with this issue and the American people paying attention as we all do the job we're sent here to do. And I would yield the floor.